After studying this module, you shall be able to learn the basic structural organization of the nervous system, learn about the various cells constituting the nervous system, learn the structural organization of the peripheral nervous system, understand structural and functional difference between the various divisions of the peripheral nervous system, learn about the integration between the central and the peripheral nervous system. Introduction. Organization of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. This module gives an introductory outline of the human nervous system. It is one of the primary systems of the body. It is an elaborate network of nerves apart from the brain and the spinal cord, which are two most important parts of the system. The primary role of the nervous system is the integration and processing of information, making sense of the external stimuli and orchestrate a response to it. At more complex levels, the brain is involved in cognition, thinking and interpretation. The module describes the structural and functional properties of the neuron, the basic building block of the nervous system. It also discusses the structural organization of the nervous system and discusses the peripheral nervous system in detail. It also looks into the internal divisions of the peripheral nervous system and how they differ in terms of structure and functions. Lastly, we touch upon how there is an integration between the central and the peripheral nervous system that facilitates the overall functioning of the nervous system. Cells of the nervous system. Neurons and synaptic transmission. Neurons or nerve cells are the basic functional units of the nervous system that relay electrical impulses from one to another. The human body contains an unimaginable number of neurons, with the cerebral cortex of the brain alone having over 9 trillion neurons. All neurons are microscopic, and although they vary in their characteristics, all neurons have certain common structural features. Figure 1 shows a typical neuron with an elongated axon. The cell body or soma is the neuron's central part and contains the nucleus. Emerging from the soma are profusely branched structures called dendrites. The neuron receives excitation at one of its dendrites from a neighboring neuron's terminal arborization. The axon is a longer projection from the soma. The longest axon of a human motor neuron can be over a meter long, reaching from the base to the spine to the toes. The axon may or may not have a myelin sheath, a fatty covering which is interrupted at the nodes of Ranvier. Neurons with a myelin sheath conduct faster than those without it. Certain cells called Schwann cells make up the myelin sheath. The neurolemma is a protective covering over the neuron. The axon carries nerve signals away from the cell body towards the nerve endings or the terminal arborizations, also called terminal buttons. The part of the axon where it emerges from the soma is called the axon hillock. The terminal arborizations into which the axon eventually divides are specialized structures that release neurotransmitter chemicals into the synaptic cleft that separate the neuron from the neighboring target neurons. Figure 2 shows electrical impulse transmission across a synaptic cleft. A synapse consists of junctions between the terminal buttons of one neuron and the postsynaptic membrane of the target neuron, usually the dendrite. When an electrical impulse in the form of an action potential is transmitted down an axon, the terminal buttons release a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that produce a depolarization, which refers to excitation, or a hyperpolarization, which means inhibition in the postsynaptic neuron. Types of neurons. According to the functions they perform, neurons can be classified into A. Sensory neurons, B. Motor neurons, C. Interneurons. Sensory neurons relay information related to the external stimuli from the sensory organs to brain or the spinal cord, where the information is processed. Motor neurons take the processed information necessary for producing a response and relay it to muscles and organs. The interneurons play an intermediary role between the sensory and the motor neurons. Given the diversity of functions performed by neurons in different parts of the nervous division system, there are of various shapes and sizes. Show some different types. The unipolar neuron is the most primitive type. Here, the dendrites and the axon arise from the same side of the soma, and hence the name unipolar. A bipolar neuron has only one dendron which arises from the soma on the opposite side from which the axon arises, and in multipolar neurons there are many dendrons that arise from different sides of the soma. The multipolar neurons are involved in higher order functions and mostly found in the brain and the spinal cord. Glial cells. Neurons are not only kind of cells in the nervous system. In fact, the other second type of cells called glial cells, which outnumber neurons by 10 to 1. The word glial is taken from glue, that is, something that joins together. The spaces in between neurons are filled with different types of glial cells. Oligodendrocytes. They myelinate some neurons of the CNS and send out extensions that wrap around the axons of these neurons. B. Schwann cells. They myelinate the neurons of the peripheral nervous system. Each Schwann cells constitutes one myelin segment. They can also guide axonal regeneration if damage happens. C. Astrocytes. They are star shaped. The arm-like extensions of astrocytes cover the outer surface of blood vessels that course through the brain. They play a role in the BBB system, which is the blood-brain barrier. This is a mechanism which impedes the passage of certain kinds of chemicals or toxic substances from the blood into the brain. This is a restrictive semi-permeability on the substances in passing from the blood plasma to the extracellular fluid of the brain. This is because of the special structure of the cerebral blood vessels. The cells that compose the walls of blood vessels of the brain are very tightly packed, and in addition the astroglial cells line them. This prevents the movement of many unwanted molecules. Only those large molecules like glucose, which are necessary for brain functioning, is transported actively through the membranes of cerebral blood vessels. D. Microglia. They respond to injury or disease by engulfing cellular debris and triggering inflammatory responses. E. Radial glia. They have long radiating arms and they assist in transporting or providing pathways for newly formed neurons during their migration. They have cup-like feet that attach to the cortical destination where the neuron is supposed to reach. Protective layers of the nervous system, the meninges. The brain and the spinal cord are the most protected organs in the body. They are encased in bony structures, brain inside the skull and spinal cord inside the vertebral column. Beneath the bony structures, there are three further layers of protection. A. Dura mater, literally meaning heart mother. This layer is thick, tough and flexible but unstretchable. It contains a large number of pain sensors unlike the other inner layers. B. Arachnoid matter. This layer gets its name from the web-like appearance of the arachnoid barbiculae that protrude from it. Arachne meaning spider, trabecula means track. It is soft and spongy. Since this membrane does not closely adhere to the brain surface, it does not follow the sulci and gyri. Some hollow spheres are formed and these are called subarachnoid spaces. These spaces are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, also known as CSF. C. Pia mater, literally meaning tender mother. This innermost layer is very delicate and just covers the brain surface and adheres to it so closely and even follows the sulci and the gyri. This layer has blood vessels but no neurons, so it is only nutritive in function and does not conduct impulses. Divisions of the nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two major portions: the central nervous system, also known as the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, also known as the PNS. The central nervous system is further divided into the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is further divided into the peripheral somatic nervous system, also known as PSNS, and the autonomic nervous system known as the ANS. The peripheral somatic nervous system is further divided into afferent nerves and efferent nerves. The autonomic nervous system known as the ANS is further divided into afferent nerves and efferent nerves. In this section, the efferent nerves is further divided into sympathetic, that is also known as SNS, and parasympathetic, which is also known as PNS. Classification hierarchy. The human nervous system is divided into two major parts: the central nervous system CNS, which includes the parts located within the skull and the spine, basically the brain and the spinal cord, and secondly the peripheral nervous system, which includes the parts that are located outside the skull and the spinal cord. Further, the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into the peripheral somatic nervous system PSNS and the autonomic nervous system ANS according to what kind of muscles they innervate. The PSNS is the part of the peripheral nervous system that interacts with the external environment. It is composed of efferent nerves that carry sensory signals from the receptors at sensory organs to the CNS and efferent nerves that carry motor signals from the CNS to the skeletal muscles. The ANS is the part of the peripheral nervous system that regulates the body's internal environment. It is also composed of both efferent and afferent nerves. The efferent nerves of the ANS are further classified into two kinds: the sympathetic nerves, which constitute the sympathetic nervous system known as the SNS, and the parasympathetic nerves, which constitute the parasympathetic nervous system also known as the PNS. The peripheral nervous system. This system constitutes the network of nerves running throughout the body arising from the CNS. Those nerves arising from the brain are called the cranial nerves, and those from the spinal cord are known as the spinal nerves. Cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are 24 in number and exist in pairs attached to the ventral surface of the brain, 12 in each of the two hemispheres of the brain. They are numbered in sequence from front to back. Most of these nerves serve sensory and motor functions of the head and neck region. Their names, origin and primary functions are given in table 1. Olfactory, its type is sensory. The origin is olfactory bulb and its primary function is efferent, auditory and smell. 2. Optic, its type is sensory, origin is diencephalon and primary function is efferent, visual or vision. C. Oculomotor, its type is sensory motor, origin is midbrain and primary function is efferent, all eye muscles except 2 efferent. Sensory motor, its location is midbrain and its function is efferent, 1 eye muscle efferent. Trigeminal sensory motor, its origin is pons and its function is efferent, skin and mucous membrane of head, chewing muscles, efferent, chewing muscle. Abducent, its type is sensory motor, its origin is pons, efferent, 1 eye muscle efferent. Another type, facial, its type is sensory motor, its origin is medulla and efferent, taste buds on anterior 2/3 of tongue and efferent muscles of face, salivary gland. Statoacoustic, its type is sensory, origin is medulla and the function is efferent, inner ear. Glossopharyngeal, its type is sensory motor, the origin is medulla and efferent, taste buds on posterior 1/3 of the tongue, rear tongue, throat and efferent, throat, 1 salivary gland. Vagus, its type is sensory motor, origin is medulla, efferent, throat, larynx, viscera and efferent, viscera. Spinal accessory, sensory motor is its type, its origin is medulla and its function is efferent, shoulder, muscle, neck, throat, larynx and viscera. Hypoglossal, its type is sensory motor, Its origin is medulla and its function is efferent tongue muscles efferent. As can be seen from the table, the cranial nerves are either purely sensory or sensory motor in function, the latter kind having dual functionality. The sensory function is referred to efferent and the motor function as efferent. The sensory motor nerves, as is evident from the table, may not cater to the same organs or muscles in the efferent and afferent functions. Spinal nerves. The spinal nerves begin at the junction of the dorsal and the ventral roots of the spinal cord. The nerves leave the vertebral column through small openings called foramen. They travel to the muscles or sensory receptors they innervate, branching repeatedly as they go. Branches of spinal nerves often follow blood vessels, especially those branches that innervate skeletal muscles. The spinal nerves make up an elaborate network which reaches across the whole body. They serve in relay somatosensory information from the various sense organs to the spinal cord and also relay processes information back via motor fibers to various muscles and glands. All spinal nerves are mixed in function, that is, they contain both sensory and motor fibers. The single sensory motor nerve separates into two different components. The efferent neurons, which make up the sensory fibers, enter via the dorsal root of the spinal cord. The efferent neurons, which make up the motor fiber, that exit via the dorsal or the ventral roots. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They have been divided into 5 groups according to what region of the spinal cord they arise from. See figure 9. The cervical nerves arise from the first few vertebrae and in the region near the neck. As can be inferred from the diagram, there are 8 pairs of cervical nerves. The next region is that enclosed within the rib cage, the thoracic area, and 12 pairs of thoracic nerves emerge here. The lumbar region, that is the small of the back, has 5 pairs of spinal nerves called lumbar nerves, and the pelvic region has 5 pairs of sacral nerves. The last pair, called the coccygeal nerves, arise from the tail of the spinal cord near the location of the coccyx. It has been non-functional in the case of human beings. Somatic and the autonomic nervous system. The peripheral somatic nervous system, also known as the PSNS, is the part of the peripheral nervous system that receives sensory information from sense organs and controls skeletal muscles. In other words, it interacts with the external environment. The autonomic nervous system, known as the ANS, is the other part of the peripheral nervous system that regulates the body's internal environment, and it also consists of both efferent and efferent nerves. It is concerned with the regulation and control of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. The functioning of ANS is a mutual responsibility of the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS. Difference between the PSNS and the ANS. PSNS consists of both sensory and motor fibers, but ANS is a motor system only. In ANS, there is dual innervation that is two sets of fibers or motor nerves to each effector muscle gland, one from the parasympathetic division and the other from the sympathetic. In PSNS, there is only one kind of motor fiber to the effector and hence unitary innervations. 3. PSNS responds to both external and internal stimuli and affects the striated muscles, that is the skeletal muscles. ANS motor fibers affects the smooth muscles and glands, that is the visceral system. Hence, the PSNS is concerned with overt movements of the body, while the ANS is concerned with the internal and the covert ones. 4. Since in the ANS there is SNS and PNS to each effector, they play an exciter or an inhibitor role. So, if SNS excites the muscles and speeds up the functioning, PNS inhibits it and slows it down, and vice versa. But in PSNS there is no effect roles and the excitement or inhibition is controlled centrally, that is, if excited the nerve fires or else it will not fire, and excitement here does not cause any inhibition of function. 5. In PSNS there are no glial in the motor pathways, but in ANS there are. 6. In the ANS there are two kinds of fibers, preganglionic and postganglionic. The preganglionic ones have their cell bodies in the spinal cord or the brain and terminate in the glial outside the CNS, which is either in a chain for sympathetic neurons or near the effector organ for parasympathetic neurons, and the postganglionic neurons have their beginnings at the ganglion and end at the effector muscles. In PSNS there are no pre or postganglionic fibers. 7. There is automaticity of effectors in ANS. The heart and the other smooth muscles have automatic contractions at a rate controlled by the ANS. The striated muscles controlled by the PSNS do not contract automatically but only when excited. Sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Both the SNS and the PNS are concerned with the smooth muscles of the viscera and the glands, but they play the complementary roles of excitation and inhibition. The sympathetic nerves are those motor nerves of the ANS that project from the CNS in the lumbar, small of the back and thoracic chest regions of the spinal cord. And the parasympathetic nerves are those that project from the brain and the sacral lower back region of the spinal cord. Difference between the SNS and the PNS. Structural differences. 1. The sympathetic nerves arise from the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord and are hence sometimes referred to as the thoracico-lumbar system, whereas the nerves from the PNS arise mostly from the cranial and the sacral regions. 2. The ganglions formed by the nerves of the SNS are collectively organized into a chain along the spinal cord called the sympathetic chain ganglia. The ganglia of the nerves of the PNS are not organized in this way, but they form ganglion in the different plexus regions away from the spinal cord. 3. The ganglia of the sympathetic nerves are situated quite far away from their affected muscles or target, although they are organized. This means that the postganglionic fibers of SNS are longer than the preganglionic fibers, but in the PNS, the ganglia are located near to the target organs and hence the preganglionic fibers are longer than the postganglionic fibers. For the preganglionic fibers of the SNS synapse with more than one postganglionic fibers and hence one nerve arising from the spinal cord is associated with several target muscles, thus enabling the widespread course of action. The preganglionic fibers of PNS synapse with only one postganglionic fiber. There is a one-to-one relation. Functional differences. The effects of the SNS are widely spread and affects many organs simultaneously, that is diffused action, but the effect of the PNS is very discrete and one parasympathetic nerve innervates only one organ. 2. The functioning of the SNS and PNS is such that they play complementary roles with regard to a specific organ or system. For example, the SNS is excitatory in function to the heart and the PNS is inhibitory in function to it. 3. The primary function of the SNS is to mobilize the body for fight or flight in emergency situations, but this does not mean it is excitatory in function for all organs. For example, in such a situation, the SNS excites the cardiovascular system but inhibits the digestive system. But the primary function of the PNS is to maintain the body and the conservation of its resources when it is in a relaxed situation. Biochemical differences. The PNS nerves are called cholinergic because they innervate with the help of the chemical acetylcholine. The SNS nerves are called androgenic because they function in association with epinephrine and non-epinephrine. 2. The PNS is also called the vagoinsulin system because it is directly involved in increasing the level of insulin in the bloodstream, which enhances the sympathetic effects. On the other hand, the SNS is called the sympathetic adrenal system because it is associated with epinephrine and norepinephrine and increases their secretion from adrenal medulla. 3. The control of SNS is by the posterior and the lateral regions of the hypothalamus, whereas the control of the PNS is by the anterior and the medial regions of the hypothalamus. Integration between the central and peripheral nervous system. The overall functioning of the nervous system requires integration between the core components of the CNS, that is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system which reaches out to other parts of the body. The sensory information is relayed to the CNS by the efferent spinal and the cranial nerves of the peripheral nervous system. Here, there is a direct interface between the peripheral nervous system and the CNS. The same happens when processed information is relayed back to effector muscles and organs via motor nerves. Integration also happens between the various segments of the spinal cord and between the brain and the spinal cord through different pathways. 1. Ascending fibers. They constitute the pathways in which information ascends from the spinal cord to the brain for processing before reaction is executed. Example, the lemniscal pathway is situated in the dorsal and the medial sections of the spinal cord. The information eventually reaches the right side of the neocortex of the brain. 2. Descending fibers. They constitute the pathways through which the integrated information from the brain descend to the spinal cord so that responses can be executed. Descending pathways can be classified into either pyramidal or extrapyramidal pathways. The pyramidal pathways controls the capacity to perform discrete movements and originate from specific parts of the neocortex. The extrapyramidal pathways controls the capacity to execute smooth and integrated movements and originate from various parts of the neocortex as well as the subcortical regions. 3. Transverse fibers. These make up the contralateral pathways within one segment of the spinal cord, that is from one side to the other. 4. Spinospinal fibers. These are either ascending or descending in nature but not connecting the spinal cord with the brain. These connect the different segments of the spinal cord with each other. Apart from these pathways, a direct way the CNS interacts with the peripheral nervous system and aids in the integration is the hypothalamic control over the functioning of the SNS and the PNS. The posterior and the lateral regions of the hypothalamus control the SNS and the anterior and medial regions control the PNS. We have learnt about the cells that make up the nervous system. The neuron is the basic structural and functional unit that transmits electrical impulses. Apart from neurons, several kinds of glial cells compose the nervous system and play various roles. We have seen that the nervous system has been classified mainly into the CNS and the PNS. The peripheral nervous system is further divided into the somatic PSNS and the autonomic ANS system. The SNS and the PNS are subdivisions of the ANS. Under the peripheral nervous system, we studied the cranial and spinal nerves. We also learned about the functioning of the PSNS and the ANS and the differences between them. The differences between the two divisions of the ANS and the SNS and the PNS were looked at. Lastly, we learned how different pathways help in the integration between the CNS and the peripheral nervous system, hereby facilitating the overall functioning of the nervous system.